the chariot is a flying vehicle, sometimes visible to human eyes, sometimes not. And it perfectly fits the idea of what we have come to call a UFO. And I believe, quite frankly, Tom, that UFOs are in two categories. There are the good ones and the evil ones. And it's not hard to tell the difference, quite frankly. I think that we are beset by UFOnauts who are probably evil in intention. And we have book after book after book written on some of the dark things they've done to people. On the other hand, occasionally there are appearances that seem more in the angelic realm. But whatever realm you're talking about, those celestial transportation vehicles are called in the Old Testament Merkavim, chariots. And even the Lord, by the way, even the Lord rides upon a chariot, which I think is amazing. For example, in Ezekiel chapter 1, and I'm sure you've spoken with others about this many times, the Lord appears to Ezekiel in what can only be described as one of these Merkavim, chariots.
Also, have you ever looked at this, like in 1 Chronicles 28:18? It actually refers to building a model, if you will, and it says, after the pattern of the chariot of the cherubims that spread out their wings.
Yeah, the pattern of the chariot of the cherubims. And that pattern, by the way, seems to be a wheel-shaped pattern. For example, if you go to Daniel and you look at Daniel's vision of the Lord sitting on his throne, Daniel 7:10 says, a fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The judgment was set. The books were open. Well, that's the setting. But that fire has a form. His throne was like a fiery flame, Daniel 7:9, and his wheels as burning fire. And we read in Scripture that those wheels go back and forth from his throne. Those seem to be the chariots of the cherubim. That is, the chariots are wheel-shaped. And perfectly, by the way, corresponding to what Ezekiel saw, as he stood by the river Kibar in Babylon, a fiery wheel came across the plain and stopped and landed before him. So, as strange as it sounds, the Bible supports the idea of celestial transportation vehicles for both angels and dark forces.
Now, so here's a hypothetical question then. If the stolen artifacts of the temple were ever found and there was a golden UFO model in there, what would the response among theologians be?
Well, that brings up the whole question of the ark. Talk about the temple, the ark has the two cherubim atop it with their wings touching, and those cherubs are guardians over the ark, and they are kind of models of what goes on at the throne of God in heaven. The cherubs seem to be God's representatives presiding over various life forms on this planet. So God is represented by these creatures. Now, all of this, and I'd like to come back to this question about extraterrestrials. When the Vatican had that meeting, they invited atheists, they invited Catholic leaders, they invited scientists and different groups. In fact, they invited people from SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. They invited astronomers. And they broke up that meeting into segments where they talked about the origins of life, they talked about the environment, the human genome, where did the human genome come from, including, by the way, Tom, the question of, did extraterrestrials seed this planet? Are they our true parents? And so the Vatican really got right back to origins in this conference, and I find that truly amazing. In other words, it's amazing in the sense that we have now come to a point in human history where the creation questions are right out there on the table for everybody to see.
Mm-hmm. Well, Guy Cosmonalgo, who wrote his Intelligent Life in the Universe that came out a couple of years ago, has already said publicly that his next project, what he called a mind-bending mental experiment, is under the working title The Jesus Seed, which sounds suspicious to me, like some kind of directed panspermia.
Exactly. Panspermia being the doctrine that there was an original intelligent life species somewhere in the universe who sent their DNA out in who knows what little rocket ships all over the universe, which would fall on various planets and sprout into other life forms. It's a kind of a wishful thinking to me, but that's what they believe nevertheless.
Mm-hmm. Let's get back to these cherubim. From what you were saying, I'm taking it that the cherubim might be higher than the angels. And there's also a question about who was the fifth watcher. You want to talk about that?
Well, yeah. A minute ago I made a statement that around the throne of God there are the watchers. And these watchers seem to represent the kingdom of the birds, the kingdom of the domestic animals, the wild animals, and the kingdom of man. In other words, the four divisions of creation. But the Bible also says that once there was another watcher, and he was called the anointed cherub that covereth, which I think is quite fascinating. The anointed cherub that covereth, and the Hebrew wording there places him as the highest of God's representatives at the throne. And guess what? The anointed cherub that covereth is simply a euphemism. It's a euphemism for a creature of great intelligence who watches over a specific area of life in the universe. In this case, on planet Earth, we discover from other scripture that the anointed cherub fomented rebellion in the heavens, later became known as Satan, but he's also known as the serpent. And we find out, and it's not difficult to find out at all, that he's reptilian in nature. That is, he is, without a question, a reptile, and he must have been a watcher over the reptilian kingdom. In other words, there used to be 5 watchers at the throne of God, and the chief among them was a reptile. And it's safe to assume that, like the other watchers, he watched over a kingdom, specifically the kingdom of the reptiles, which, as we know from archaeology, was once the dominant kingdom on this planet. Suddenly it died out and became represented by a bunch of squiggly, creepy little creatures, and their leader must have been vanquished. And once they were great, now they have fallen. And that's sort of the beginning of this long story about the watchers. The anointed cherub that covereth is now the abhorrent serpent who is running his own program. and we read in the book about what's going to happen to his program.
That's one of the most fascinating things I have ever heard. I'm going to have to follow up on that personally. I absolutely thank you for that. I'm looking at your article here. I'm actually holding the February edition of the Prophecy in the News magazine in my hands. Your lead article, the feature article, The Extraterrestrial Question. And you write, religious authorities must ask whether these assumed aliens from space evolved from some primordial ooze or were created in the same fashion as Adam. Also, various reports state that these spacemen often appear in radically different forms. Could it be said of them that, like man, they were created in God's own image? Most likely not. A lizard, gray alien with bulging black eyes, insectoid or other bizarre creatures does not bear God's image, but then you say parenthetically, curiously, however, they do resemble historical descriptions of demons.
Yes, they do. As a matter of fact, we don't have to look far to see historical descriptions of demons. All we have to do is go to any historical library